What is up, Mets fans? Welcome back to the True Mets Talk podcast. It's your boy CP, and we are continuing our Mets off-season discussion because it is October, and unfortunately, the New York Mets were not October ready in 2025, but they are fully in the process of coaching changes. They're in the process of gathering information on impending free agents, both internally and externally. And as you can see on your screen, we are talking about none other than the biggest free agent possibly in and around Major League Baseball, but definitely on the New York Mets, and that is Polar Bear Pete Alonso. Because as the Yankees are on the brink of elimination, analysts and MLB Network alike are not wasting any time talking about Pete Alonso and him potentially going to the Yankees in free agency. As you can see with this quote right here, Pete Alonso would look good in a Yankee uniform playing first base, hitting 35 plus home runs and knocking in over 100 runs. And I would like nothing more than to not see that happen. That cannot happen. If that happens, what you see right here, if that happens, I am not going to be a happy camper whatsoever. And I know a lot of you all tuning into this video right here will also not be happy. But again, before we fully get into this discussion, talking about Polar Bear Pete and maybe some other options, or at least one other big option to replace Pete Alonso in this lineup, make sure to hit those thumbs up buttons, subscribe to the channel, and comment your thoughts and opinions down below. Okay, Polar Bear Pete Alonso, the Mets versus Pete Alonso, this saga part 2 that we see as a continuation from last offseason and how those negotiations played out before Pete Alonso signed a 2-year deal with an opt-out after the first year. And everybody should have known that he was going to be opting out if he put up the correct statistics in comparison to the down campaign that he had in 2024. And he did just that. Pete Alonso took all that pressure, all the naysayers, all the negative comments, both from the outside, outside of this organization, this fan base, and also within this organization and this fan base. And he shut everybody up. 38 home runs, another season of 125 plus RBIs, an OPS that was approaching 900, around 871, and a batting average at 270 plus, which was a career high for him as well. He had a fantastic season offensively, and the biggest concern, the biggest issue, I would imagine, for people that don't want Pete Alonso to return is not only the contract valuation that the Mets are going to have to pay him, or anybody for that matter is going to have to pay him to join their team. And we'll get to that here in just a second. I promise we will. But the defense, Pete Alonso, again, had another struggle-filled season on the defensive side of the ball. And Mets fans can talk about he is a great first baseman at scooping the baseball and saving the infielders on bad throws. 100%. He's one of the best in the business at first base in doing that. But if you're taking a look at all the other statistical defensive values that we have to go off of, whether it's defensive run save, DRS, whether it's outs above average, OAA, you can find these statistics on Fangraphs, especially. I like their statistical breakdown on defense because it's kind of hard to get those metrics, in the game of baseball. But when you're talking about those statistics, he is a very bad defensive first baseman. And that has been a talking point surrounding Pete Alonso as long as time, right? As long as he's come up in this organization and come up to the major leagues in Queens. And not only fielding and the range, but also the throws to home plate, the flips to first base, right? On a PFP where the pitcher's covering. We saw with Kodai Senga. And I've mentioned this quite some time now because this has been a thing where Pete Alonso has been so bad at throwing to particular bases all over the diamond, and it just simply hasn't changed. And for what reason that is, I don't know, but that is the biggest hole right now in his game that is going to maybe be the X factor of whether David Stearns wants to pay him or not. And honestly, I think that's kind of crazy because I'm just going to say this up front. especially with the lack of options around the league, right? In terms of replicating what he has done for the Mets with his bat and what he can do with the Mets alongside Juan Soto with his bat, you know, I think the Mets have to bring him back at all costs. And you are not going to rely on an internal option. If the ideology is we are not going to get another big name free agent to replace Pete Alonso, and we're just going to roll with Mark Vientos or Ryan Clifford and try him out at first base. I'm not on board with that. Listen, Mark Vientos and his status on this team making it to 2026 in the Mets uniform is already in doubt. He had a fantastic rookie campaign and he slumped majorly in 2025 in his second full season. And where the Mets want to get to in 2026, if you're telling me and you're trying to sell me on relying on Mark Vientos as being that option, because we were talking about him being that option for the Mets in 2025 if Pete Alonso left last offseason, I'm sorry, I'm not on board with that. And as much as I like Ryan Clifford, I think that he could be a valuable, at least DH option for this team once he's done and proven himself in AAA. I'm still not on board with that as a replacement for Pete Alonso on a win now team in 2026. None of these guys are going to replicate his offensive output. And not many guys on the free agent market externally can even replicate his output offensively. But when you hear David Stern's talk in the press conference that he gave after the season was over and stressing run prevention, that kind of puts a light bulb on the top of my head. And I'm like, okay, maybe he's saying this as a precursor in case Pete Alonso doesn't come back and he doesn't want to give Pete Alonso the money that he's going to be asking for alongside Scott Boras. Now, if he does leave, this is a big if because things can play out and the Mets can retain him. Steve Cohen can also step in and sidestep David Stearns and the contract negotiations if he really wants to, given what Pete Alonso did in 2025. And we'll take a look at the statistical values here in just a second and a 3-year outlook of Pete Alonso over the past 3 years. But, you know, I really do think that the Mets are going to have to get creative in a world where Pete Alonso is not a New York Met in 2026. Brett Baty can be thought of as a hybrid option. If Pete Alonso comes back, Brett Baty is your everyday third baseman with what he put up offensively in 2025. Such a huge step up of what he posted in his previous seasons, right? The conversation surrounding Jeff McNeil, if Pete Alonso is not a New York Met, also changes drastically. And the whole roster, when we talk about this roster shakeup and changing up the core, I don't think you can change up this core when it comes to the three main guys are supposed to be main guys with Pete Alonso, Juan Soto, and Lindor. And I am counting Juan Soto as a part of this core now because he's going to be going into year 2. And let's face it, he's going to be here for a very long time given the contract. So he is now part of this core. And I think of the core as being Alonso, Nimmo, Soto, Lindor, and McNeil. And Nimmo, there's not really much you can do with Nimmo in that contract. They're not going to move off of Nimmo. They're going to have a very hard time trying to find out where Nimmo best fits into this organization, given the lack of defensive ability and those legs that he is showing moving forward. But I think the odd man out is going to have to be Jeff McNeil. That's a very movable contract. He's a very movable player because he did have a pretty decent 2025 campaign. But if you're telling me that nobody internally can replicate what he did, I'm sorry. That's just not true. And I know that there's a lot of Jeff McNeil fans in this fan base, and rightfully so. I get that he adds defensive versatility, but the Mets need to get younger. And if there's a position to get younger at, with a movable player, it's at second base. And you have an internal candidate right there in Brett Baty that can fill that void. You have Jet Williams coming up as well to fill that void if Brett Baty's not playing third base. And I think that, if Pete Alonso leaves, this isn't a scenario, if Pete Alonso leaves, that you're going to have to sign a big name free agent, probably playing third base for you and moving Brett Baty over. So that brings us to, this next topic of who that big name player can be. I know a lot of Mets fans have been talking about him. We all talked about him actually last offseason when he was a free agent before signing a similar contract to Pete Alonso. And also, by the way, I want to bring up the name because we talked about Vientos. We talked about, Ryan Clifford as potential options. We're going to talk about Murakami coming over from Japan as well when he is posted. There will be plenty of conversations surrounding him because David Stearns, as we all know, went to Japan to scout him. And I think that they like Murakami. But in my mind, if you're saying Pete Alonso versus Murakami, I'm taking the proven Pete Alonso without a doubt rather than the guy that is jumping over to a brand new league, brand new style of baseball, and we don't know how he's going to translate on a win now team. That's just my humble opinion. But let's make this comparison because a lot of Mets fans have been talking about this one name. And by the way, if you hear certain names being talked about, like Vientos, right, like McNeil, or conversely, externally, like Murakami, we're going to be revisiting these names all off season long. So this is the part where I tell you once more to subscribe to the channel because these are fluid conversations that we are having in the beginning of this off season, and they will ramp up as the hot stove streams start up between Rob and myself. And if you all know Rob's stance on Pete Alonso, we are going to be having a lot of back and forth, I am sure, when we start those streams up surrounding this very topic. So I wanted to bring up this idea that a lot of Mets fans have been proposing. And this is a name that myself and Rob really liked before he ended up in Boston. And that is the debate surrounding Pete Alonso versus Alex Bregman. And I give you the statistical, mostly the offensive statistics here and the 3-year past outlook of what they've produced since 2023. I mean, outside of 2024, in that abysmal season for Pete Alonso, where he had an OPS below 800 and he had less than 100 RBIs at 88, he still posted 34 home runs and a 240 batting average. Wasn't ideal. But outside of that season, Pete Alonso pretty much clears Alex Bregman. I think that everybody knows this in most offensive categories, especially when it comes to the power numbers. And even with the batting average, I don't put too much stock into Pete Alonso's batting average. He's a high strikeout guy. Alex Bregman is thought of more so as a low strikeout guy, but still, the batting average is what it is. But I'm talking about what can these players do for the New York Mets and take this lineup to where it really needs to get to. And if you're telling me that offensively, Alex Bregman is going to come in and produce something similar to Pete Alonso offensively, I will tell you that you are crazy. And 2025 shows just that, especially when it comes to those power numbers. Now, I understand that Alex Bregman had a quad issue that, forced him to miss a plethora of games this past season. I think he only played 114 games. That's also a sticking point to this conversation as well surrounding Pete Alonso. He is a workhorse. Pete Alonso will give you 150, maybe even 160 plus games like we've seen over the past couple of seasons on a regular basis. Now, the thing that separates these two players and the idea of this debate, I am sure, is that if you sign Alex Bregman, if David Stearns and Steve Cohen identify Bregman as a potential Alonso replacement, you will also have to go out there and essentially go after another option at first base externally. And I think in that scenario, you'd be talking about Bregman plus a guy like Murakami. And that's where I can see the argument of replacing Pete Alonso's offensive output in terms of the power numbers with those two guys versus just Pete Alonso by himself. And the defense gets drastically better in that scenario as well. So even though I do like Pete Alonso and I really hope that the Mets re-sign him, you cannot argue, nor can I objectively, that Alex Bregman, Manning, third base for the Mets in 2026 makes this defense a lot better than if Pete Alonso was at first base. That is far and beyond 100% a factual statement. Look at the OAA, look at the DRS for Pete Alonso versus Alex Bregman. I know that Bregman has had his fair share of errors over the past 3 seasons, but I'm talking about those advanced statistics for the fielding metrics. It's night and day different. But also, you have to, I guess, consider the age and the contract valuation of what these two players will want, because there are some differences according to Spotrac there, and it's very important to talk about. But before we talk about that, the other thing that I wanted to point out here with this situation is that clearly Pete Alonso is going to have a market for him in this free agency, right? The Giants are going to be involved, I'm sure. As we just saw in the previous slide, the Yankees are going to be involved. I think that relying on getting Alex Bregman for the Mets is such a far-fetched idea, because if you take Pete Alonso's market and the competition for him, you can probably double that for the likes of Alex Bregman, because that's just the value of each position. Teams that need to add to their lineup are always going to value a competent bat at third base rather than first base, even given the defensive adjustments. And if Brett Baty didn't have a good season last season, or a season that showed promise, then we'd be having a different conversation right now. But I am inclined to believe that the Mets believe in Brett Baty at third base going forward, and therefore would be better suited to address first base by retaining Pete Alonso rather than backfilling third base and moving Brett Baty over to second base, because then you're stuck in a situation of needing to move Jeff McNeil, like we just mentioned as well. Hopefully, everything's making sense right now as I'm explaining it, because there are a ton of moving parts that us fans have to understand, and David Stearns and his front office have to evaluate when it comes to this sort of situation. It goes far beyond just these two names. But again, going back to the conversation of Alex Bregman's market, listen, the Mets are going to have to compete with the Red Sox, who are desperately going to try to re-sign him and may even end up overpaying him, given what transpired when he came into that organization with Rafi Devers and them trading him away to prioritize Bregman. They're going to have to compete with the likes of the Yankees, who probably also will be interested in solidifying the corner positions alongside Pete Alonso and their pursuit of him. It's probably one or the other for the Yankees, I would have to imagine as well. The Tigers were linked to Bregman before he went to the Red Sox, and I'm sure no matter how their season ends, they are going to be interested in Bregman at third base for them. And there's a plethora of other teams that are going to be in the market and are willing to overpay for a soon-to-be 32-year-old Alex Bregman, who turns 32 before the season starts. And there is a one-year age gap difference here between Pete Alonso, who's going to be 31, turning 31 here in December, and then also Alex Bregman, who's going to be turning 32 in March. But let's look at the contract valuation moving forward and what Spotrac has decided the market value is going to be for these two players. Pete Alonso is valued at 6 years, $176.5 million. And Alex Bregman is valued at 4 years, $100 million even. So you're talking about a $29.5 million AAV for Pete Alonso versus a $25 million AAV flat for Alex Bregman. And the $4.5 million don't really make a difference, I would have to imagine, for the New York Mets. So it's not really about that, but more so the years that each of these players are going to want. And I don't even think when you look at the years, it's night and day difference because of that 1 year age gap. But I'm assuming, given David Stearns' philosophy of not overpaying players, especially pitchers, but also position players on the north side of 30, that's going to also come into play here in this situation. So again, if you're asking me who I would rather have back on the New York Mets, especially given how much success Juan Soto and Pete Alonso were both able to enjoy in the lineup back to back together, I would prioritize Pete Alonso, but I can definitely understand the debate and all the talking points surrounding Alex Bregman adding his bat and defense when looking at this comparison compared to just Pete Alonso's offense. A lot of people call Pete Alonso a DH that's playing first base. I think that is a little bit far-fetched. I do think that Pete Alonso has certain qualities that make him a competent first baseman defensively, and that is picking the baseball, but he has a lot of work left to do. And at this point of his career, given the pattern of what we've seen from him defensively, I'm not quite sure he's going to turn that around. But there are other options outside of Bregman, as I mentioned, Murakami. I mean, there's a whole merry-go-round of free agents to consider, and there's also internal movements that would have to happen, whether it's Mark Vientos, Brett Beatty, or Jeff McNeil to make something like this happen if Pete Alonso walks. So, Mets fans, this is not the first time you're going to hear me talk about these two players as a side-by-side comparison. So buckle up. There's a lot of things to consider, but the Pete Alonso saga part 2 is officially starting soon, and we'll see you all for the next off-season podcast episode right here on the True Mets Talk podcast very soon. Peace.